Good morning everyone. Today we are going to continue with the 8th chapter of your book, that is how do organisms reproduce. We have studied about asexual type of reproduction in the previous video. Today we are going to take up with the sexual reproduction. Now sexual reproduction, it involves two parents, one male and one female, right? So there is a fusion of two different sex cells. That is, these sex cells, they are also known as gametes. We also call them as gametes or the germ cells, right? The sex cells are also known as gametes or germ cells. Now, because there is fusion of two different types of sex cells, this gives rise to variation. Because half the number of chromosomes, they come from one parent, the other half come from the other parent, and the two fuse together to form a zygote. So because they are coming from different parents, naturally there will be different sets of chromosomes, which leads to variation, which give rise to evolution, right? So in that way, sexual reproduction is more important than the asexual reproduction. It has more importance or the more advantages over the asexual reproduction. Of course, there are certain variations in asexual reproduction also, but those variations are very, very minute changes that take place, right? So here we see some variations because there is fusion of male sex cell and the female sex cell. So today we are going to study sexual reproduction in the angiosperms. Angiosperms means the flowering plants. All the flowering plants come under the heading of angiosperms. So today we will study about the reproduction in flowers. You know, flowers, they contain the male sex cell and the female sex cell. So today we are going to study this. Now this is the diagram of a flower. Flower has different parts. This we can show a little. This swollen part, this is known as receptacle, or we also call it as thalamus, right? It contains, this is the swollen part which holds the flower. The green, some green leaves are seen here, as you must have seen a rosebud, right? A rosebud, it is enclosed by some green leaves outside. Those green leaves, they are known as sepals. So the main function of sepals is to protect the flower in its initial stages when it is a bud. So first part is the thalamus or the receptacle. Second part is the sepals. We also call it as calyx, right? So these main function is to hold the flower or to protect the flower when it is in the bud stage. Next comes the petals. These are the petals. Petals are the colored part of the flower. And because it is differently colored, brightly colored, this attracts the insect. And then these are scented also, right? So this scent and the beautiful colors of the petals, they attract the insects for pollination, right? Then after this, so this is the main function of the petals, to attract the insects for pollination. Then there are two main parts of the flower which are responsible for the reproduction. One is this part, this is called filament, and this is called anther, right? And they together form the stamen, right? They together form the stamen. Stamen is the male part, right? This is the male reproductive part of the flower. It contains two parts, the anther and the filament. Inside the anther are present the pollen grains, the yellow powdery substance that you see. That is known as the pollen grains. These pollen grains, then they have the nucleus inside, which will go and fertilize the egg, right? So this is known as stamen. So it is also known as Androidium, the male reproductive part of the flower. Then in the center, this part, this drawn with red color, you can say, this is known as the carpel. Carpel or pistil, right? Carpel or pistil. It is also known as gynoecium. Let me take the other pen. Right? So this is also known as gynoecium. This is the female reproductive part, which consists of three parts. Right? Let me draw it here for you. This is this broad part. This is known as the stigma. Then this long tube-like structure, this is known as style. And this broader part, that is known as ovary. And inside the ovary are present the egg cells or the ovules, right? Here there are ovules. So this stigma, style and ovary, this makes the female reproductive part, which is known as carpel, or we also call it as pistil, right? And biologically it is known as gynoecium. So there are four main parts. The main four parts are sepals, then of course petals, I forgot to write here. Petals are known as, the collection of petals is known as corolla. The collection of petals is known as corolla. Right, so these are the main four parts. Of course, thalamus is present at the bottom. Then the sepals, petals, stamen, then carpel or pistils. Right, so these are the main parts of the flower. Now, further, how the fertilization takes place in the plants. So, for that, these two parts, that is the stamen and the carpel, are responsible. Now, how fertilization occurs, let's see that. Now, for fertilization to occur, first of all, the pollen grains from the anther should come and fall on the stigma. That is very important. So, there are two types of flowers. One is unisexual flowers and the other is the bisexual flowers. The diagram which is drawn here, this is a bisexual flower, because it has got both the male and the female reproductive organs in one flower only. They are then known as bisexual. But if it contains either of the two, either it has got stamen or it has got carpel, then it is known as unisexual flower. Right? So, for this to occur, that is for fertilization to occur, first of all, pollen grains should fall on the stigma of the flower. Now, this transfer of pollen grains, please learn this definition also you have to learn. Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is known as pollination. Right? And there are two types of pollination. What are those? Those are, number one, self-pollination, and second is cross-pollination. Now, self-pollination, it occurs in bisexual flowers. That is, in one flower only, when stamen and carpel are present, the pollen grains from the anther will fall on the stigma. Now, this pollination, it takes place by the help of certain agents like wind, water, insects, etc. When the wind blows, that time also pollen can flow from the anther and fall on the stigma, or through insects like the butterflies, right? Or in the aquatic plants through water it takes place. So when it falls from anther to stigma of the same flower, then it is known as self-pollination. Cross-pollination is when the anther fall from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower. Maybe in the same plant, maybe in the another plant, but of the same species. Pollination or fertilization will occur only when they are the pollen of the same species. Right? So cross-pollination is either the pollen grains will fall from one flower to the other flower of the same plant, or of another plant of the same species. Then the pollination may occur. Now what happens after the pollination takes place? Let's start this. Once pollination has taken place, then what will happen? Now this stigma, it is sticky. It secretes a chemical which is very sticky. So when the pollen grains will fall on the stigma, they will stick here. And because of the presence of that chemical also, these pollen will burst. And they will develop a pollen tube. Right? Each pollen grain has two male gametes. That is, the nuclei which are present in this, they are the male gametes. Right? So, when it will form the pollen tube, this pollen tube will pass through the style. No, this is stigma, then this long tube is style, and this oval structure, this is the ovary. So the pollen tube will develop and will run through the style and will be attracted towards the ovary, right, where the ovules are present. So what will happen? The male gametes, two male gametes, from the pollen tube, these are the two male gametes, they will travel through this pollen tube, right? And and they will enter inside the ovary. Now this is the ovary, right? Inside the ovary, the ovule is present, and in the ovule these cells are present. Now let me tell you about these cells. Here you can see this ovule itself is a cell, one cell. Inside this 3 cells are present here, in which out of these 3, this upper one, this is known as the egg cell. These 2 are synergids, right? So this is the egg cell. About synergids you will read further in your higher classes, and about these cells also you will read in the higher classes, so I don't want to confuse you here. You only learn that out of these 3, this is the egg cell, and these are the 2 polar nuclei present. Now inside these cells you can see the nucleus present here, right, in all 3 cells. So these are covered by a cellular membrane, but these are just the nuclei. They do not have any cell covering. And then there are 3 cells here. So total 3 plus 3, 6 cells present here inside one big cell. So total of 7 cells. And these are 2 nuclei. So 3 plus 3, 6, and 2, 8 nuclei are present in total. So these are just the 2 nuclei, polar nuclei. So when the male gametes will travel through the pollen tube, they will be attracted here and they will enter through this here. This will rupture, right? And the polar nuclei will enter through this part. This is known as micropyle. This opening is known as micropyle, right? So it will enter through this micropyle and will get one of the male gamete. It will fuse with the egg cell. So egg cell plus the male gamete, this will form the embryo, right? And this fusion of egg cell with male gamete is known as syngamy. Syn means 2 here, gamy means the gametes. The fusion of 2 gametes here will take place. That is the egg cell plus the male gamete, and will form the embryo. The other male gamete, it will fuse with these 2 polar nuclei. So polar nuclei plus the male gamete, this will form the endosperm, right? And this because there are 2 polar nuclei, right? These are 2 in number. 2 polar nuclei plus 1 male gamete. This is fusing together. So that is why this is known as triple fusion, right? And because 2 types of fertilization are taking place, one syngamy and one triple fusion, so that is why this is known as double fertilization. Double fertilization. Right? Once again, we'll repeat this. The pollen grain will fall on the stigma. They will burst open and will form the pollen tube. 2 male gametes from each pollen grain, they will travel through this pollen tube and will enter the ovule here. Inside this, one of the male gamete will fuse with the egg cell and will form the embryo. This process is known as syngamy. The other male gamete will fuse with the polar nuclei, that is the 2 polar nuclei, and will form the endosperm. This is known as triple fusion. The syngamy and the triple fusion together, they are known as double fertilization. This process is known as double fertilization. Now, when this fusion has taken place, it will form a zygote, right? This fusion of the male and the female gamete together is called, will form the zygote. Now, this zygote, it will keep on dividing, redividing, right? And this will then, this ovule, this will develop into it will develop a hard coating around it, and this will form the seed. And this ovary, this will ripen and will form the fruit. You know, seed is always present inside the fruit. So this ovary, it will be ripe and will form the fruit. The ovule, this will develop a hard coating and will form the seed. And meanwhile, when this ovary becomes ripe, what will happen? The sepals and the petals, they will fall. They will shrivel and fall off. So, the place where the fruit was present, right? Where the flower was present, there only this fruit will be born. After that, what happens? The seed, when this is sown, it will germinate, right? When it will get appropriate water, air, temperature, this will germinate and will form the radicle and the plumule. This radicle, it will form the roots, and the plumule will form the shoots, right? And this will give rise to a new